Yeah, okay.
Okay, welcome everyone to the IHR Digital History Seminar. Before we get going, I just want to make everyone in the room aware that we are live streaming this particular talk, which means you may want to change the tone of your questions at the end to accommodate that, or maybe not say things you'd otherwise say, but just to make you aware of that. And we do have listeners online who will be potentially asking questions as well of our speaker. Briefly introduced Tim without going through the full list of achievements, I guess. Tim's a professor of digital history at the University of Sussex. He occupies the office across the corridor from me. And he's probably most well known for his work in 18th century British history, particularly the history of poverty, but also the work on various digital resources in and around those areas of study. So London Lives, Connected Histories, Locating London's Past, and most recently, well, more recently and soon to be launched, I suspect, the stuff around digital panopticon. At Sussex, he's also part of something called the Sussex Humanities Lab, which means Tim's been dragged towards contemporary history in more recent times. And some of you may have seen the recent announcement of the BBC Connected Histories project, which I guess combines some of the expertise at Sussex with the phrase Connected Histories, which you've used before.
Work for me.
Sorry?
They stole the title.
Oh, they stole it, okay.
Without letter
tonight, Tim will be speaking on, I guess, a very familiar topic to him, which is the Old Bailey courtroom, and in particular work he's been doing over the last few years, which many of us have seen bits and pieces of, around the experience of being in the Old Bailey courtroom and some of the work he's been doing reconstructing the sounds and sights that we found there. So I'll hand over to Tim.
Thanks very much. And thanks for inviting me and all of that. And it's great to be back at the Digital History Seminar. I'm afraid I haven't attended for a while as a result of personal circumstances beyond my control. Having a job, I think, is what that comes down to. And it is much to my regret. Well, this paper is a tentative attempt to begin the process of combining different forms of data to write and research what I think of as a slightly different kind of history. And I want to start with a simple observation that I suspect to this audience will seem entirely unnecessary, obvious beyond measure. And what that observation really is a simple statement that our understanding of the past, how we interact with the leavings of the dead as historians and critics, is almost totally focused on text at the expense of other varieties of data, perhaps space most self-evidently. We've arguably been pretty good at making text available online for reuse and reanalysis. Certainly the archive of Western texts has been pretty comprehensively digitized, at least prior to 1923, when Mickey Mouse lets us, gives us free rein. And beyond text, in ever-decreasing volumes, we've also digitized inherited maps and images, creating a pretty good resource for anyone interested in the layout of cities or artwork on paper. But we've been rather less good at physical spaces and physical artifacts. But even these are gradually being captured in a digital form, though one should perhaps note that beyond architects and gamers, most of us have been rather backward in figuring out how to work with 3D in particular. As a result, it seems to me that we are confronted with both a real opportunity and a fundamental challenge. The opportunity lies in the fact that once digitized, all these types of inherited stuff, text, image, object, space, and sound, a series of relatable formats. The long journey from the archive to the museum to the archaeological site is now no more arduous than the journey from one folder to the next or one application to another. And the challenge, it seems to me, is to figure out how to take advantage of this new affordance to ask different kinds of questions. And my answer is to take a bit of text I know too well, the Old Bailey Proceedings, and to see what happens when you add a basic form of distant reading to an analysis of space and an analysis of sound. As usual in my life, or so it seems, I'm only halfway through this project. And so this really is kind of a report of work in progress. The only problem is that this work arguably started in 1993 and I see no end in sight. So work in progress seems, well, I don't know, sad, but I hope you'll bear with me along the way. So what I'm going to do today is very briefly look at text mining in the proceedings before adding a bit of 3D modeling, and finally presenting some recent work on what might be described as speech mining, and then using these resources to interrogate briefly the experience of being tried for your freedom or your life at the Old Bailey. The place I need to start is with the proceedings. These are published accounts of all trials held at the Old Bailey between 1674 and 1913, and comprise some 197,745 trials in 127 million words of text, about half of which purport to be recorded speech, verbatim records of what was said by the person being tried or the witness or the counsel. They also form a comprehensive bureaucratic record of the trials themselves, and particularly from 1778 to 1913, are considered a legal record of that bureaucratic process of trying and convicting and punishing individual miscreants. They also form a large text object marked up in XML, which Bob Shoemaker and I and a lot of other people, mainly I should particularly mention Sharon Howard and Jamie McLaughlin, essentially worked through the 2000s to put online. And as importantly as anything, they contain 240,000 individual stories and traces of 3 times as many lives. Now, between 1998 and 2008, I was privileged to be involved in the process of digitizing those records. And they have, in a way that surprised Bob and I certainly, become a popular resource for historians, students, and genealogists. About 2,500 people a day use them. But of course, the place where these trials took place, and where these words were spoken, and these lives were changed, no longer exists. It was replaced by a building currently on the site in 1907, which was then rebuilt in the 1960s. So we started off with what one might think of as a deracinated text, a text out of time and out of place, a free-floating stream of words, or mental image, perhaps, enlivened by just a few contemporary drawings. This is Thomas Rowlandson and Augustine Pugin's rather famous image of a trial in progress, perhaps the most used and referenced trial image we have. So the challenge becomes, how do we move beyond images and text like this to something more compelling? And where I started was with a basic distant reading of the text undertaken with Bill Turkel at the University of Western Ontario. And this is a graph that some of you may be familiar with. It's a scatter chart of all those 200,000 odd trials, each one represented as a single dot with killings picked out in red. There's a log scale on the left, and the number of words in each trial is recorded. This is basically a scatter chart of the distribution of text between those 197,000 individual trials. It goes from the shortest trial report in the collection. Elizabeth Draper, indicted for felony, was found guilty. There she is. To the longest, at more than 155,000 words. The trial of William Palmer, found guilty of poisoning John Parsons' cook in 1856. A great trial, which I would recommend to anyone. As a form of distant reading, this initial visualization and the exploratory journey that underpinned it, because my shock in working with Bill on this was really that in figuring out what we were asking and how we were representing that data, we had to go on a very long journey. And this is now going back to 2009 or so, to figure out both how to represent this stuff in a way that's effective and how to actually relate what was a abstract visualization to what had been a textual analysis of a body of words. It taught us a huge amount about both the proceedings and the history of the court of the Old Bailey. In the patterns revealed can be found evidence of the rise of lawyers and the changing nature of court reporting, and most significantly, the rise of plea bargaining as a normal component of British justice. The area in the bottom right-hand corner represents a whole slew of trials for very, very serious crimes, including killing, reported at just 8 to 20 to 30 words. And in looking at those, we had no idea they were there. But we said, what's that pattern? And started investigating, drilling down. And what we found was, I plead guilty. And it turns out that that whole notion of pleading guilty, of, if you like, moving the trial process from the courtroom to the police cell, was a direct and recordable phenomenon that could be traced at scale in the records of the 19th century. And that came as a surprise. It also led us to write an article which got rejected by all the best journalists, and finally came out this spring in the Law and History Review. Following, I am very tempted to publish the readers' reports, all 12 readers' reports from the editorial panel of past and present and history workshop journal, all of which decided in the end that this was not for them. But the point is, this remained very much an analysis of a massive text object that mixed up bureaucratic text, the sort of thing that I tend to describe as mind text, words created in silence for silence consumption, with the records of what purported to be verbatim speech. We do this all the time, confuse types of text. Every time we skip from dialogue to description in a novel, every time we read quotes from speeches and interviews, all mashed together. And I think this is a particular problem when you start looking at the text analysis methodologies that are so popular in the digital humanities. Things like topic modeling, for example. We assume that all text is somehow equal. And quite frankly, it's not. But what emerged as we made the proceedings more available to different fields was that our historical assumptions, our blindness to the different types of text, that it was all just text, was not an assumption that everyone else made. And in particular, one of the people who did not make that assumption was a guy named Magnus Huber, who was a corpus linguist at Gießen University. And he pointed out to us that the proceedings contained a massive body of inherited text purporting to reflect speech, and then he volunteered to mark it all up in XML, which was a remarkable thing. And he created, in that process, a site called the Old Bailey Corpus online. And so, as a result, while we had up till then kind of mixed up mind text and speech text, following on from Magnus's work, we also could begin to separate them out, one from the other. And the result was the Old Bailey Corpus online. And everywhere the text indicated a quote, he said, she said, counsel, witness, the court, Huber and his team both marked up the speech itself, so it could be analyzed separately from the text around it, and marked up the character of the speaker, giving them a gender and a role. And this, of course, also associated the speech text with the trials themselves. So all the details of all those 200,000 trials in XML could be used to filter for guilty verdicts or violence or whatever, and we could then pull out the text that was speech from those. This gave us a relationship with types of crime, verdicts, and punishments, and a new kind of object of study. And at a rather, I think of it as a rather profound philosophical level, the division between mind text and speech text challenges our assumptions about historical evidence in a way that I think is important. What is said, particularly said to an audience, evidence is real people performing real communication. In the process, the presence of the audience sets limits on the content of the speech and provides contextual reaffirmation for the speech's relationship to a contemporary understanding of reality. Speech text allows us to move beyond the fundamental postmodern conundrum and observation that our object of study is simply text, rather than a knowable past. And I'm going to be confounded in this audience when you all turn around and say, well, that made no sense whatsoever. And that'll either prove the point or not. I'm not sure which. Anyway, in other words, speech text is fundamentally different as a form of evidence, arguably providing a real-world context for understanding discourse that is directly connected to a knowable, lived historical experience, an experience validated by its collective public nature. And that, it seems to me, makes it different. In contrast, mind text is effectively unmoored from any seriously knowable reality and includes the scribblings of the insane and the sociopathic. This kind of text may well provide evidence and have a relationship with a real past, but it's essentially unknowable and unverifiable as it exists in the first instance, simply between the ears of its creator. In a sense, this is part of the process of source criticism that means that we take letters and exchanges of letters more seriously than we do simple unmoored writing. It is about how we understand the validity of what's being said in the past through the eyes of somebody contemporary to it. With mine text, there was no necessary feedback loop between the originator and its reception. So this new emphasis on speech text allows us to think rather differently about what was important in the proceedings and what they could be used to evidence. And the first thing it did was challenge us to think a bit harder about that courtroom and the impact of space and environment. If speech text was validated by an audience, we had better get our head around who that audience might be and how the theater of the court worked. In other words, we suddenly needed to know a great deal more about the building itself, vanished over 100 years ago. And this is a kind of timeline we ended up with, including a series of rebuildings and repurposings that brought the built environment more fully to the fore. So rather than simply following statutory change, we decided to say, well, how does that all fit with the evolution of the material court? There was an enclosing of the building in 1737. Up to then, it was an open-sided building, open to the environment. A courtroom, previously open to the elements on the north side, was enclosed, leading, of course, to a series of outbreaks of cholera and the death of the odd Lord Mayor, which seems like a small price to pay. It was here that notorious criminals like Elizabeth Brownrigg was tried and condemned. But the big change came in 1774 when George Dance was commissioned to redesign the Sessions House and to make it fit for purpose. And over the next half-decade, the rebuilding went on, creating what would become a standard layout for British courtrooms, the exemplar for a courtroom which would later be translated and copied for use throughout the British Empire and beyond, particularly in Australia and Canada, although quite self-evidently not in the US, which models its courtrooms much more on a religious building and religious layout. Attacked and rebuilt after the Gordon riots in 1780, it was Dance's building that would serve as the old court for the whole of the 19th century until it was finally demolished in 1907. A new court was then added in 1824, behind the old court, and a third court added in 1847. Along the way, flush loos, new facilities for court officials, and increasing separation between defendants, witnesses, and jurors were all built into the structure, with hallways and separate entrances and facilities being added incrementally over the course, particularly the 1840s and 50s. In particular, a secure and closed route from Newgate Prison to the area directly below the dock was installed during the 1810s, creating the possibility that the defendant could be brought up directly to the dock from the cells, brought up from the cells. So it's become a classic phrase in British English. And then, of course, sent down. This represented the gradual evolution of what Julian Hansen describes as a kind of spatial or new spatial syntax, in which the forms of new administrative systems are gradually built in the workings of the courtroom. And what she's done, and she worked out with Bartlett and architecture, has essentially looked at how courtrooms in the 20th century model and reflect the bureaucracy of court administration. So, jury rooms, judges' withdrawing chambers, spaces for legal representation, and the discussion between defendant and their counsel. All of that stuff is built into the. But she took that analysis from 1900 and essentially analyzed the model of the court that had gradually evolved at the Old Bailey between 1810 and 1900. And so part of this project is to read back that notion of a spatial syntax into the evolution of the court in that century. For me, and from the perspective of speech text, the rebuilding took on ever greater significance. This was not to denigrate the importance of events like the Gordon riots, the first fleet to Australia, and the passage of the 1855 Magistrates Act, which effectively removed half the court's business to local police courts, but to suggest that understanding the context of speech text needed a different form of explanation than that basic text mining. In the first instance, we simply went back to our text mining to see if the changes in the building were reflected in that larger, massive text object. And the answer was, yeah, maybe. Yeah, kind of. That was pretty interesting and appears to suggest a correlation between the enclosing of the building and some substantive change in the nature of reporting. But as it was before the period during which the proceedings can really be fully relied on to report speech text at length, it didn't get us very far. And Dance's rebuilding itself also looked interesting, as did the addition of the third court in the 1840s. Though as that coincided with the removal of the death penalty from most types of crime, there's no clear causal link, and it's coincidental. All of which just pushed us back to the courtroom as a physical space, and the job of turning drawings, maps, and images into something that could be interrogated more fully. I started doing this a few years ago rather naively in SketchUp, which some of you may know. It's not a very good program, actually, but it has one great advantage in the world, which is it's free. Before realizing that I just didn't have the time and the skills to do that well. So for the model I'm going to show you in a minute, I've relied on a colleague at Sussex Humanities Lab, Ben Jackson, who has a great deal of experience and works in 3D Studio Max. And in the first instance, we focus on reconstructing the internal dynamics of a courtroom as designed by George Dance in the 1770s, just when the adversarial trial was supposedly being normalized, according to and which continued in use throughout the early 19th century, witnessing tens of thousands of trials over the course of its life. Our next task was to do the same thing, is to do the same thing for the two smaller courts added in 1824 and 1847. But first, we had to locate it on the most detailed map we could, and in turn, find its place on Google Earth, before starting to lay out the building on the basis of sort of the architectural plans. And this is actually the all-important plan from our perspective because it shows the layout of the internal bespoke furniture that was inserted into the stone-built outer structure. In the process, we also compared the model to contemporary images, primarily by Rawlinson, but really any image we could look at. Here's William Garrow haranguing a witness. There's a kind of 1840s watercolor. Another later scene from the same court. But most importantly, that all-important image to us was still that one by Thomas Rawlinson and George Pugin. And it is apparently comprehensive and drawn with what appears to be a consistent use of perspective, although you could never be, of course, at the point of perspective from which it was drawn, because it's the middle of the wall. But that's neither here nor there. The architectural detail was drawn by Charles Pugin, and the people were then added by Thomas Rawlinson. And it was then published by Rudolf Ackermann as part of the Microcosm of London in 1808. It is precisely the right date for our purposes, and it's visually compelling. How you could ever get that number of people into the room, as it turned out, is a matter of complete bewilderment. But that's a different story. On the basis of these materials, Ben Jackson built this model in 3D Studio Max. I was hoping to take you to his website. You can take down the URL and go at any point, and that would be great. But unfortunately, the joys of connectivity, of borrowed laptops, and the general fate of all digital history seminars, that there needs to be some digital failure along the way, means that we can't actually visit that. Fortunately, being fully aware that that was likely to happen, I have some slides. And what you can see is a relatively small courtroom, the defendant facing a semicircle of judges. You can see where the defendant is. The witness over here, facing the judge. The jury, there are two juries, one on one side and another jury on the other, one for Middlesex, one for the City of London. And they basically went back and forth, trial by trial. And finally, the judge at the top, and the shorthand recorder to whom we owe all this text, sitting in a relatively privileged position in the upper right. Let's see. It's a view from behind the defendant with a mirror, supposedly to concentrate light on his face so that the jury and the judge could see into his soul through and judge his or her guilt on that basis. And in themselves, these are a great deal of fun, and they were a great deal of fun to work through, and just that dialogue between documentation and digital object was a remarkable and joyous thing to work on. But they don't start to work as historical evidence until you begin to interrogate them more closely. And by this process of interrogation, what I really mean is trying to create the model itself. Contradictions are revealed between plan and depiction. Long-held assumptions are challenged, and in the end, occasionally overturned. And to momentarily overclaim for the methodology, building the model itself forces you as a historian to undertake that most basic comparison of sources, to sift the real from the simply stated, to return perhaps to almost a von Rankian approach to historical method, but to do so across different types of source material. There's a lot more work that we need to do in relation to the model, and I will describe the next few steps in a minute. But in the first instance, the modeling revealed just how small and intimate the courtroom was, and how Rowlandson's depiction aggressively misleads us about the scale and grandeur. It also reinforced the sense of theatricality involved. And at this stage, we were able to come to a couple of relatively secure conclusions on the basis of the two varieties of evidence we then had to have: distant reading and the 3D modeling. And the first conclusion we came to was the importance of relationships, and the ones which are gradually being built into that court, the new ones that are being built in that court. And these lie in the changing relative position of the defendant, witness, judge, and jury. There is, for instance, a clear transition with the building of this new courtroom to a situation in which the defendant is being increasingly differentiated, both raised up and set back from the witnesses and the victim. So rather than defendant and victim or prosecutor having an equal place, they are increasingly being separated apart and given a different relationship to both the jury and the judge. In other words, the character of conflict at the heart of a trial is being reimagined, with the witness and victim relocated ever further from the defendant, but both facing the judge. At some level in the process, community resolution, which is that medieval model of trial, was replaced by court judgment, and the roles of all the actors in that drama are subtly recreated and changed. And second, the model building in particular revealed the importance of levels. That if anybody's sat in a jury recently, anybody sat in most British courtrooms, they'll be familiar with the extent to which these things are ridiculously hierarchized states in which juries and judges and counsel and defendant are all on ever so slightly different levels. And this is built in to the Old Bailey court in some ways for the first time. And it entailed lawyers speaking upwards to the judge, jury, witness, and defendant from a cockpit several feet below their eye level. Audience, the judge, jury, and defendant looked down on the stage below. But in this instance, they hadn't created the stage. In other words, what was created, at least for a short time, 130 years, was the real feel of a theater in which, as a barrister, you were forced to perform to the gods, but were not given any space from which to do so. And judging by all the depictions we have of contemporary lawyers declaiming in court, to do so with all the gestures and conventions of that new theatricality of the last half of the 18th century and the first half of the 19th century, which saw the inscription of honesty, of emotion, of truth in a series of gestures and hand movements, of looks and stares that would be instantly recognizable to any theatrical audience by 1830. The courtroom was essentially built and required those barristers, like William Garrow, to suddenly use a new language of theatrical representation and truth claim. All of which effectively led us back to the importance of understanding that speech text. So, to return to that subset of the text, let me remind you of the timeline that I think is important in terms of the layout of the building. 1770s and 80s, the 1820s and the 1840s, in combination with the 1850s for legislative change. And this is our first stab at exploring the distribution of that speech text over time. The yellow line reflects the percentage of trials in which speech is recorded at all. including a marked low in the 1780s and a marked decline in the 1830s and 40s. This is that same line in a rather more readable form. And along with all subsequent visualizations, this has been created by Sharon Howard, working in R, at the Digital Humanities Institute at the University of Sheffield. And my reading is that the marked decline in the percentage of trials with speech reflects, again, that phenomenon we observed through more, through that other variety of distant reading. That it reflects the rise of plea bargaining, in which cases of which involve no speech, and which become more common from the 1840s. This line, if you like, is a reflection of the bureaucratization of the trial process and the movement of judgment from the courtroom to the police interview room. The creation, if you like, of a bureaucracy of judgment located outside of that court and embedded within a newly professionalized police force. Next, you get the blue line, which is the number of utterances per trial. This becomes a measure of the role of lawyers and witnesses. Is there a lot of back and forth, conversation and cross-examination, pragmatics, to use the term from linguistics? Again, as with the percentage of trials with speech, this seems to reflect the dramatic decline in the role of the trial as a complex conversation. And finally, you get the green line, which is the average word count per utterance. So basically, how verbose were these people? In dialogue with the other two, this again reflects a major transition in the 1810s and 1820s, so that when someone did speak, rather than short interrogations back and forth, we get ever longer statements. But to interrogate that further, we need to ask who was speaking. So, a nice stacked proportional chart, speech types, defendant silent, defendant speech, speaks, no speech, all trials, in a slightly more readable form, labels. In other words, along with a growing number of trials where no speech is recorded, there's also an apparent suppression of the defendant's voice in that conversation. So that by the mid-19th century, when speeches themselves were getting longer, defendants were increasingly mute, presumably leaving the long diatribes to their barristers in a new way. To represent this same conclusion slightly differently, we can facet out just the trials where the defendant speaks versus those where they remain silent and leave the speaking to others, and it looks like that. And the combined data looks like that, which I think is kind of difficult to interpret. And Sharon chose these colors. I don't know why she did. I think, yeah, with less, oh, never mind. Again, suggesting the 19th century saw the relative silencing of the defendant. We can look at it this way. You can also divide the same defendant speech between those who were found guilty and those who were found not guilty, which to my reading suggests that there's a substantial distinction, almost a genre change, between these two types of trials, and that the voice of those eventually found guilty by the system was increasingly being excluded, either actively or passively, from the proceedings, and that the relative balance of authority in this theater of justice was changing as part of the same process. Integrating this data shows a clear transition in the number of words spoken in trials, depending on their outcome, with a crossover point somewhere in the second quarter of the 19th century. Though you need to read this against the conviction rate overall, which, as many of you probably know, was going up at a dramatic rate over the course of 100 years, from 1750 to 1850, going from in the region of a conviction rate of about 60% to a conviction rate of 85 to 90%, which is very similar to modern conviction rates for cases that go to trial. And that needs to be kept in mind because the rising number of words spoken in not guilty trials from an ever smaller proportion of the total number of trials being captured. Working to draw out differences in speech of women versus men, along with other measures of difference, children versus adults, violent offenders versus petty thieves, and all those other variables. For gender, it is looking like men are marginally more talkative than are women, pretty consistently through the whole data set. Divide this by crime type. So the total number of words per trial by crime type looks like this. While the number of words spoken in each of these trials for specific crime types looks like this. Now we'll get to a comparison that you can actually read in a second. Comparing the two throws up significant and distinct patterns of speaking in breaking the peace, killing, deception, and royal offenses in particular. So just looking from left to right of breaking the peace. There are large numbers of trials, again, at the low end in terms of the overall number. In killing, in deception, the apparent distinction between all words versus speech words is, again, dramatic and not yet clear to us, as is true with royal offenses. I would say deception and royal offenses in particular have a pattern in the first half of the period that is distinct and different and needs explanation, which we don't have yet. What that means is entirely unclear to me. But give us a decade. I don't know. In the short term, what the analysis of speech text does is extend and reinforce the analysis of bureaucratic text, or the whole text object, if you like. But when these forms of text-speech mining are combined with a fuller appreciation of space in which that speech was uttered, and in particular the intimate, theatrical, performative character of the courtroom itself, we end up with both a different way of evidencing historical change and a body of data that challenges us to think differently about how we understand the materials we've inherited from the dead. Now, our next step include semantic analysis of that speech. Did people start pleading for mercy or challenging the court? Can we take out common phrases, and can we use those to identify patterns in like the cultural representation of both truth, guilt, and innocence that would reveal how the court itself is shaping that wider culture or is being shaped by it? We also need an ever more granular analysis of the ways in which speech maps onto the bureaucracy of justice. We really need to take out groups, particular parts of London perhaps, groups by age, certainly by gender, groups that one can associate with gang activity, for example. All these become possible to pull out separately. So you could, for example, pull out, well, depending on whether Adam Crimble's work on the identification of Irish names in proceedings and through censuses can be relied on, we could pull out all the Irish defendants and say, how does that work? Or we could look at all the people who are being convicted and for crimes committed in a particular parish or a particular part of London. We also need to tie these speech acts to the individuals who uttered them and locate them this single dramatic scene in the longer narrative arc of their lives as Londoners, as defendants, as prisoners, and for a proportion of them as transportees. And that's where this work essentially maps into the bigger project of the digital panopticon, the global impact of London's punishments. I think it's a total title, where we're taking all of this stuff, tying it up with all the London Lives material, and then also all the founder and survivors material associated with the transportation records to Australia, and the prison records, and the 1841 census, and 37 other data sets. It's been a 5-year project, and we are just coming to a completion, and that will allow us to, for example, differentiate from this group of people by how much money they had in their bank account when they arrived in Australia. Were they well off or not? We can divide them up by tattoo. We know all the physical marks that these people have. We could take out everybody who had a tattoo or got a tattoo on the way over. We could do it by height. There was a biometric analysis that suggests that actually short people were more likely to be found guilty and were more likely to be recidivists. So, which makes perfect sense to me. So there are all kinds of ways of cutting this, and then going back to that analysis of speech text. And I'm been waiting now for 4.5 years for that data set to be fully integrated. And it is getting to the point where it is, at which point we can start taking the 66,000 people that are captured as a collective prosopography of crime and punishment and turn it to account in thinking about how we understand this speech text and that most dramatic moment in their lives. And finally, I feel that this work demands that we take much more seriously that space as a place of speech. So we're also putting in a soundscape into the 3D model of the court and translating all that recorded speech into a form of sonification so that we can sit there and listen to it, not as computer-generated speech, but as a sound wave, a line of data that represents age and height and weight and tone and the rhythm of language without attempting to do that kind of gamification trick of adding actual spoken speech to it. This is not about gamification or historical reenactment. It is about finding the tools that will allow us to securely identify the patterns that exist in that speech text. Now, as I said at the beginning, this project is not finished, but it has forced me to reconsider what I thought was a secure history of the court and the criminal justice system. I hope it suggests alternative ways of understanding 100 other types of inherited materials, from parliamentary debates to sermons to political speeches. A third, perhaps, of our inherited text can be identified as having been spoken in a particular place. And I think adding that kind of detail, that granularity, that alternative aspect to each of those forms of text actually gives us another way of understanding and analyzing that inherited body of material. Now, in the end, the data challenges us to understand what it took someone like John Ebenezer Martin to stand up in court on the 18th of September, 1871, without counsel or support, and to cross-examine one witness after another, to question their evidence and assert his right to be heard. I want to be able to answer when he asks, as he did of the main witness against him, how long have you known me? I want to be able to at least affirm that we know his voice. Thanks.
Thank you, Tim. I'm going to ask the audience and see if they have any questions. You're stunned into silence.
Can I leave them?
It's really great to see how this has progressed, because I remember when you first talked about starting to model Old Bailey. How much more work is there to do on the model, the physical model?
Well, the actual model of the George Dance one is very little to do. I mean, really, we have it. A few more iterations we could put it in the soundscape tomorrow and start playing with it. And in a sense, we haven't, simply because we suddenly got all the speech text as a separate series of files, so we've been playing with that more. I mean, what I need to do is go back and actually do the work on the architectural developments of the 19th century. Because initially I was so focused on that one court that I didn't. I noted, you know, the flesh loos and all that, but I hadn't actually had the intellectual framing that allowed me to see why they might be important. And so that needs doing. Lots to do.
Are you going to be able to take account of acoustics?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. No, that's actually, well, relatively easy. I mean, in terms of spaces, and you can, of course, model the surfaces and how all that works. Of course, then you get that process of saying, well, how many people are there in the room? What are their weights and heights, and you know, what does 18th century linen sound like when it ruffles as opposed to nylon? You know, all of those kinds of odd issues that go into creating a credible soundscape. And it strikes me that, again, as with building the model itself, it becomes a journey of like intellectual interrogation in that. And my only real frustration is I don't really think that we have the tools. I'm thinking about this coming away. How am I supposed to publish that? I'm not quite sure. And secondly, I don't know that we actually have the tools to incorporate that process into an academic argument that we can have easily. I just don't know who I'm going to argue with about wrestling 18th century limits. John Stiles, probably.
I was just thinking about, because you said at the beginning that actually, this is all brand new, it's really exciting. But the people who've done a lot of this in terms of modelling things are classicists, and people working in archaeology.
Yeah.
So in terms of the intellectual frame, this isn't a question, it's just me thinking out loud. Perhaps we need to do a lot more reading of that, what they've done. Because presumably they have had those conversations about how you, in an academic setting, deal with the material in a digital format. I know the work of Matt Nichols at Reading, who works on Rome. Yeah. And he's again working in a different type of framework. But I wonder what parallels we can learn from the classicists for this material.
Yeah. And I think I have tried to read some of that, and I've been actually kind of frustrated. In a sense, there's the extent to which the modeling is towards a particular kind of archaeological end, about representing what is there, and the dig process, and the imaginative process that goes not from like archaeology to like social interaction, but archaeology to a reconstruction of buildings. So far for me, it's slightly limited how useful that seemed, which is just probably me not having been listening enough. Though that I would say architecture and archaeology are the areas that I'm most interested in at the moment, and actually architecture more than archaeology, just because there is a very highly theorized language and debate basis in that field that again is about has come up against modeling. It gets odd because at some level architects always model from a blank screen up, and archaeologists like model from the earth downwards or whatever, and they represent very different approaches, and I can't decide for myself which one is actually most useful for thinking about something that I don't really want to archaeologize. On the other hand, I do need a better theoretical framework than I have, and like I said, the best one I've found so far is Hanson's stuff in 20th century architecture.
Thinking about theatricality, performance, and so on. And I was thinking that familiar thing in a police cell where, for the benefit of the tape, the defendant is nodding. Yeah. Are there silences between the words? Is silence and the gaps between words, which something that exists and could be detected from the transcripts, or are there any devices that can allow silence to?
I mean, the closest one gets to that is the pragmatics issue about how you structure a conversation, how you know that you stop speaking and I can start, that sort of thing. And there is a fair bit of work in linguistics on precisely that. Obviously, we can't easily reconstruct the silences in the court, although somebody will say that there is silence there. And the areas that I think are related, that I'm most interested in, I think are recoverable, is the relationship between the technologies of recording speech and how that impacts on what that text stream looks like. And the thing I always get back to is shorthand and the move from brachiography to Pittman in the 1830s and 40s, because brachiography is based upon letter form. So it is, if you like, a textual shorthand, whereas Pittman is based on sounds and syllables. and therefore becomes an oral shorthand. And what I would love to do is analyze speech text on either side of that transition and see if we can't use what comes out of that as a way of interrogating what that stream of speech actually, what the limits of its changes are, I guess. But yeah, silence. I would love some silence.
Slightly related kind of question. Just when we're thinking about kind of the tempo in the courtroom. I mean, presumably you know how many trials are on a day, but is there any way that you could kind of see, like, do they take regular breaks? Does it change if it's after lunch, the outcome? Does it rush towards the end of the day? Anything like that?
Well, it's actually a real problem because most sessions, certainly up until the 1810s, 1820s, last 3 days. And they do it as an undifferentiated list of trials. So you don't really know what, when in the morning, and when was in the afternoon. And that actually, up till now, is kind of confounded. You would love to know, does everybody get off or get found guilty after a big lunch? Sort of question. And how does that work? What you can do, and I think what is more likely to come out of this, is that notion of a kind of probabilistic stream. So, if the first person is found guilty, and the second, and the third, and the fourth, does that mean that the fifth is more likely to get found innocent or guilty? I mean, can you actually kind of model how those run? I think that it would be possible with a shed load of work to relate the sessions to the reporting in the newspapers, certainly from the 1820s or so, and get a sense of precisely what day and all the rest of it. The problem is that as it stands, we have the only, and this gets quoted endlessly and boringly by everybody, the only statistic we have on that is that in 1832 supposedly the average Old Bailey trial lasted 8 minutes, and that's based on a false calculation of the length of the sessions and the number of courts. So there's lots to do, but it's not actually straightforward. And there also then becomes that other issue of, well, which court is it in? And for the most part, we can judge that because that's recorded in proceedings. But nobody's actually started. That's another job for us to do, which is to pull out and say, well, here's the old court, here's the new court, here's the third court. Does that make a difference? And use that as a lever for analysis.
Can I go back to the comment you made about how do we make an argument about this? And I don't really care about necessarily the how do you make an argument in terms of write a paper or write a book, whatever. Mm-hmm. Because one of the things that really struck me as you were going through this was that you were building together sort of layers of evidence, layers of ideas. But you're also creating a bit of a cacophony, it felt like to me, a sense that by virtue of the ability to divide up, say, the speech data between this is speech, this is not speech, this kind of trial, this kind of person, you're creating kind of an overwhelming amount of potential ways into understanding the information you have in the Old Bailey corpus. And it made me think about something you said at the beginning, which was about that mooring you talked about, the idea that there are some things in this corpus, which is the speech and perhaps the speech alone, which we can get a sense of validation of that as being an actual experience because we can moor that against the reaction of someone in the room or the fact that they performed it to someone in the room. And I guess what I'm coming to is it feels to me like what you've been doing with a lot of this work is unmooring everything that we thought we knew about how we can use this particular set of evidence to know anything about the Old Bailey courtroom, and left us with the individual experience of performing a speech act is what we have left. And then we end up just moving from a series of acts of doing something in a room, or alternatively, the only thing we actually know is what that person sitting there recording is doing, because they've recorded this stuff. And so it's more of a comment around that kind of, you talked at the beginning about the nature of historical evidence and how you use it as historians. And it feels like what you've done is, in order to try and know more, you've made it even harder to know anything.
Okay, I'm up for that. I fundamentally, well, there are two sides to this. One is that my fundamental belief is that history writing, academic history writing, is actually a genre exercise. That essentially the forms and styles of history writing that we've inherited are, you know, wildly conservative in the first instance, but also absolutely controlling. And that the ways in which they're controlling is you know, embedded within, you know, footnote practice, evidence, how you use evidence, how you use text and quotes in relation to truth claims, and that's fine. But I think it's also, well, actually, I don't think it's fine. I think it's complete bollocks. I think it's us being unimaginative and failing in the duty of innovation as writers that every generation should be challenged by. And we have, I think, my contemporaries, our contemporaries, have been immensely conservative about it. And they've been conservative because they're caught within a particular administrative and bureaucratic system called the university sector. And the point is that as a result, I have absolutely no problem in tearing up by the roots and burning on a giant bonfire most of the conventions of normal historical writing. And I would love to do so because I don't actually believe them as effective mechanisms for either experientially creating empathy and a sense of experience about people in the past, or actually communicating effectively in the public sphere the arguments and debate that we want to have and use evidence for. So this becomes, yes, a way of undercutting an older story, but I hope it also becomes like an exploration, a journey into a series of tools and forms that would allow us to more effectively make statements about the past and the experience of the past, and how we understand the past in the present. I don't know if that I mean, and that I have no idea where I'm going to go with that. It's just that I would love to be able to find the contexts in which exploring the 3D model in terms where playing with data becomes one of the effective ways of a wider audience actually engaging with this stuff. And I think that's all possible. It just doesn't actually fit very nicely between two covers.
I'm going to very quickly comment on that, and then there's a question from Twitter. I suspected you would say something on those lines, but also, though more eloquently than I would. But I guess what's really striking to me then is that you've come to that via computational approaches to stuff that was created in the past, as opposed to through abstract philosophizing. And the projects that are created and talked about in this room may often be accused of trying to kind of fix the past and say we know this thing because we've abstracted from it, we've got a count, we've got a graph, right? And obviously that's rubbish. But the point is that I'm interested that you've come to that through this process as opposed to through the abstract philosophizing process, and that's productive and useful and really good for history, I think. The question from Twitter, you can respond. The question from Twitter is from Alan Crimble. And he says, my question would be how the findings can be unpicked from the changing editors and reporters. In the Old Bailey.
Yeah, I mean,
and the Old Bailey.
And do I believe, well, Bill and I spent, I think, 3 years staring at and where we ended up with was a critique of the Old Bailey Proceedings and how historians have used it, and a recognition that actually it is, up until certainly 1778, up until arguably 1800, a rubbish source for what happened in court. That it was absolutely a popular format publication that responded more to the whims of the Lord Mayor and changed mayoral year to mayoral year, rather than an effective record of precisely what happened in court. And that transition from, if you like, scandal sheet to dry report is something that has to be taken into account in this. So I don't think, in fact, that we have, for most of the proceedings, a secure mooring in terms of meaning and relationship to the past. I think for the 19th century, again, it's not. Well, this gets philosophical beyond where I want to be, really. I mean, for myself, I don't believe in anything past my optic nerve, and I don't believe in the proceedings as a clear and unproblematic, having any kind of clear or unproblematic relationship to precisely what happened. So, in a sense, where I end up getting back to in response to Adam's question is precisely back to that issue of history writing as genre and the extent to which, well, I don't necessarily believe that we can recover reality. What I do believe is that we can make use of the inherited materials we have to construct a more effective way of using the past in the present and engaging an audience. I don't know if that answered this question.
You might respond on Twitter also.
Yeah. No, just like
I also have a question in my hand.
So yeah, I wanted to ask you about this sonification that you're trying to get at. For me, that sounds a bit abstract. So I was just wondering if you could. So because you're saying consciously, it shouldn't be about gamification. It should be about something different. So where you're trying to go with that, or what sort of the.
Yeah, well, I mean, what all models of sonification tend to come from kind of things like quantitative biology and environmental studies, and the idea is that you take a data stream and you sonify it. You give it characteristics that allow it to run into a sound stream. And I suppose where I want to be is basically somebody sitting with their eyes closed or with a VR headset in the middle of the room, listening to the voices that make up a trial as a sound stream coming from different directions, so that you have a sense of what it's like to hear a trial from the perspective of the defendant or the witness or the judge, and that isn't again about. I mean, I would love that kind of sonification to represent. To feel like speech, but not be understandable as such, like a slightly unknown foreign language, I guess, with characteristics associated with it. And what one does with it after that, because of course then it becomes, you would want to combine it and use that sonification as part of a broader analysis of the, I don't know, a few million speech utterances that you do that way. I'm not quite sure what to do with that. It's just something I kind of want to do. The other thing I really want to do, and this is one of the next things, is to start thinking about trials as forms of genre, rather than thinking about them either as bureaucratic acts or anything else. So getting back to that notion of text and using some of the kind of theoretical framing that we have for other types of text, and particularly literature. Just because it seems to me that you could, for example, take each, well, one of the visualizations Ben is working on my behalf, is essentially taking every trial and saying, well, bureaucratic speech in one color, court speech, witness speech, defendant speech, all as, if you like, on a line. And not really caring over much if they're short trials or long trials, but just how many different voices there are in them and how they map as different voices across the line of the trial, and then just like stacking those and clustering them in order to identify, if you like, the trials that have a particular kind of rhythm of speech to them, and seeing if we can't, again, divide up that 197,000 trials into a series of what I think of as genre forms.
Anyone else have any questions? No?
It's quite a boring one, which sort of follows up from what James was saying in a rather prosaic way, which is about talking about the difficulty of getting this research published in places where other historians will encounter it, which is, it's not a new problem. And I just wondered what you thought about alternative ways of publishing the outputs of this kind of research.
Well, I mean, all I can do is despair, which I do mostly. I mean, I think, well, Bob Schumacher and I recently had an experience with Cambridge University Press that has left me bruised and wounded and lying bleeding on the floor of the academic world. And what we did, we had a book called London Lives, which was based on the London Lives website, and which was written in a wiki. It was designed as a alternative kind of academic writing. There were 4,000 URLs. I copy edited every single one of those 4,000 URLs personally. It took me 6 months. And we had a contract with CUP. A director of humanities publishing said, yes, this is scholarship of a new kind. This is innovation. This is what CUP needs. He then left. And we had a contract, and when it came to submitting the volume, they turned around and said, well, you know, we can't really accept anything in any of the normal wiki formats, and we can't accept an EPUB or any of those things. So could you give it to us in Word? And they insisted that we give it to them in Word, and we had to. And what came out of it in the end was a flat PDF-like ebook. They eventually did get the ebook right 6 months after they promised. 6 months after all the publicity for the book had gone out, and ensuring that it got no reviews and was generally a waste of 10 years of my life. But what that illustrated to me was that actually the publishing industry is still very much working on a model that says, you know, we know how to take a Word file and turn it into a book and turn a book into profit. And the CUP had a clear and present model for how to do that. And that until and unless we essentially take back control of academic publishing and start to push more innovative models that allow us to think harder about what kinds of things we want to publish, in what format and how, then we will end up publishing nothing but rubbish ebooks that look flat and boring and can't be navigated and have none of the functionality that you would automatically expect from, you know, a cheap game. And what I would say is that, you know, we are working on it. We're just setting up a press, a university press at Sussex, and with very much the hope of finding different platforms so that, I mean, the thing I always get back to is why the hell we don't have a kind of vertically integrated relationship between secondary writing and underlying data. I just don't know. Sam has been doing it for a decade. And there are no technical problems in doing so. It is a cultural and institutional problem. So, you know, that's the first thing. And then, you know, there are just all sorts of platforms and formats that allow you to do so much more. I mean, you Scalar, for Christ's sake. Any of these things are at least working and possible and robust, and all the things that are preventing that happening are actually not technical things at all. They're cultural things, and they're bureaucratic and institutional things. They're the requirement to get a job, so you have to have a book. The requirement to get tenure in the U.S. so that you can then become a conservative and ridiculous person in a ridiculous system. Sorry, that's revealing my attitude towards American higher education, which is slightly more jaundiced than my attitude towards British higher education.
I look forward to see what happens with the Sussex University Library, Sussex University Press.
We'll see. I mean, we're just in the middle of drawing up a business model for that, and it then goes back to the University Knowledge Exchange, Knowledge Research and Exchange Committee. And any ideas, entirely welcome. Any off-the-cuff business models that I can plagiarize, are equally welcome.
Do you have any final questions?
This is quite a tangent, but you've spoken a lot about history as genre.
Yeah.
Have you looked at literary criticism on types of genre? And personally, for me, I read quite a lot of modernist literature because it is fundamentally about pushing barriers of genre, and in certain cases, and I'm thinking especially of factography from post-revolutionary Russia, this is they are dealing with the same question of how you describe reality.
Yeah.
Or no reality.
Yeah.
Or is there a reality?
Well, I mean, I don't read. I love that
Factography.
factography. That's great. I'm going to have to look into that. But I don't read as much modern literary criticism as I should. What I have had a recent wonderful experience of doing was teaching a course on creative on life writing, autobiography and biography, and co-teaching it with Margarita Jolie. And it was the only time in my life I've ever taught creative writing in any form. And that just delving into the issues and the ways in which literary criticism has engaged with that notion of a semi-factual form of writing, autobiography, was absolutely revealing in terms of the limits to which within which we actually work ourselves. And my real frustration is that I think we kind of lost the plot on that, and that actually the critique of history writing as genre fell out in the 90s. That there was a moment of real innovation where, and I think of the rise of graphic novels, I think of a lot of work on narrative forms in the 90s and hypertextual forms as well. And that actually in the last 10 years, historians have I think, become more conservative about the formats in which they write. And I don't really understand quite why we lost the plot quite so thoroughly. But that's,
We should probably close shortly. Before we do, I have a final question, which is possibly slightly silly, but it's to do with the modelling, and to go back to that, and the fact that you've recreated a space that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And I wondered if the space still existed, would you have recreated it? Because that's something that ultimately that architects do.
Yeah.
They design a space, they model a space, the space gets built.
Yeah.
And whether that's a process you've gone through the other way around, because would you think that would matter in any way? Would you purely have abandoned all of this and just go and spend your time standing inside the actual Old Bailey courtroom if people let you in?
Well, I mean, the point is that there are actually some good 18th century courtrooms around, and I could probably go do that. And I sometimes think, well, why the hell am I doing this? If and I'm not sure I have an easy and straightforward answer to it, except that the process, the journey of staring hard, and asking the question, well, what level is this? What is the relation between this level and that level? How comfortable is that bench? What happens if you're 4'3"? Can you see over the front of the dock? All those sorts of things you could do in a real space, but in a sense, you don't have the structured timeline journey of the creation of the space in order to ask and interrogate those specific questions. So I still think that there's a value and virtue in the modeling process that goes well beyond standing in a particular space. And I should ask Katrina about, you've been looking at a particular place that it does exist recently. I think you have.
Is this the project I do with Butler?
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, we're looking at isovists and field of sight in historic Manchester, but I'm working with Butler at the School of Architecture to do that, and they're modelling using their software. So most of the buildings still exist, but we're interested in, again, looking at historic evidence and seeing if we can apply that to the architectural models.
And the one I was actually thinking of is that, the trial of the 38 radicals, which the building still exists.
Yeah. Again, I've been using a representation, and I'm trying to work out whether that representation, just like Timston, fits the reality or not. But the courtroom still exists.
Yes, yeah. And did you find sitting in the courtroom an easy way of interrogating the image?
Well, there's no one there. So I'd have to fill it with people. So I think, again, that process of looking at the digital images and then work out
Mhm.
what you do with that. Again, with our isovis and field of sight, I think is something you can do on a computer much more easily than running around an 18th-century courtroom.
Yeah, and of course, how you then, it's also easy enough to evidence it and cite it as a finding in a way that it's more difficult to do than if you sit there and say in your footnote, yeah, well, I went along to the courtroom and stood up and kind of bent my knees a bit and to pretend to be shorter than I am, and I couldn't see anybody. So,
Thank you. I think we should probably close there by thanking Tim for a stimulating talk and an interesting discussion. Before we close the stream, I just want to announce that we do have another digital history seminar this time. This was meant to be our last, but it's not. Chris Warren from Carnegie Mellon will be here on the 23rd of May, and he'll be talking about the 6 degrees of Francis Bacon project. And we don't have details on the website yet, but we will have shortly. So I hope to see you as many as possible there. Thank you.